And so I am going to kind of give an abbreviated version of history in 20 minutes. Obviously, you can take full courses up to, majoring in history. So this is just a very brief snapshot in time. All right, let's talk a little bit about United States settlement. Um, Most of you can throw this kind of back into your grade school, high school, middle school days, even probably college if you took some history in college when you were attending college. Um, in general, the United States was settled east to west. Everybody pretty well knows this. Um, the acreage of the current United States is somewhere around 2 trillion acres, depending on the source that you look at. Originally on the East Coast, we started off with our eastern states, and then through a series of purchases, annexations, cessations, we acquired more territory, more lands. Um, Between all of these annexation, all of these additions, we added about 1.3 billion acres in the Western United States. This was a very different landscape than those folks who had colonized the East Coast were really accustomed to, but we didn't know much what to make of it. Obviously, we had no social media. We had very little way of correspondence. Um, before settlers were out west, you didn't even have the mail system. And so telling people about what these landscapes looked like and how different they were from landscapes they were coming was a really, really difficult sort of proposition. About 300 to 500,000 people, it's estimated, came west on the Oregon Trail and some of the offshoots from there, settling in Oregon, California, Washington, and places along the way. That may not seem like a whole lot of people, but it sure was a whole lot more than was out there. There were Native American populations scattered all over these landscapes, and intermixing with the white settlers sometimes went smoother than others. This was not a vacant landscape, though. There were humans on this landscape, and European settlers contributed to an increasing population. When the United States realized that they had acquired all this territory, they figured that we probably ought to be able to, we have to be able to account for this territory. And so they sent folks out west to do surveys and use the rectilinear public land surveys, as you guys are probably familiar with, townships and ranges, and then sections. This was an interesting time in development. Not all sections were, it was kind of just open landscape. It wasn't necessarily owned by anyone. We'll get into a little bit more of that later on. Our founding fathers had the foresight to understand that education was going to become important in this country and set aside certain sections of the landscape for school lands. They were put into a trust for education. And there's other divisions of this landscape that we'll talk about as well. In general, there are about 3 eras in our U.S. landscape, one being just a transition era. From 1776 to 1891, roughly, this was disposition. The federal government wanted folks to go west. They wanted colonization in these new territories, these big, huge areas. And they were encouraging folks to go west. They also were trying to get companies to get economic and commerce and trading going. And so they were giving away lands to encourage people to settle in these big, huge Western landscapes. Towards the end of the 1800s and then beginning into the 1900s, we realized that land isn't necessarily an infinite resource, and started to kind of hold back on this disposition. Some places were, there were these really pretty places, and we were thinking like, why? Maybe we want to preserve some of these places. In the beginning, in the early 1900s, we had been in sort of a management of these lands, or conservation of these lands. As the lands were being developed, as I said, there were entities that were given lands. So there were school lands, there were, all kinds of different ways that land was dispersed. One of the more interesting ones is about the railroads. And as I said, you couldn't even send a letter across the country, much less um, go anywhere other than on horseback or foot in the early days. And so there was a big incentive to get railroads through to the West Coast. So railroads were given sections of land. They were given a 200-foot strip right away on either side of the railroad. They were given free construction materials, and they were given every even numbered section in a strip 6 sections wide on either side of that railroad. And so if you look down here on the southern end of Wyoming, this is a good example, you can see that it looks a little bit lighter to you guys, I think, than maybe this yellow up here. And that is because every other section in here is white, meaning that it is private land and it's actually owned by the railroads. Also land was given for roads and highways and development of any infrastructure for commerce, trading, and transportation into these territories. Then we began also at the same time to encourage folks to have a enticement to move out to these lands. We began giving away lands. The Homestead Act, there were several iterations of this act. In 1862, the federal government said you can have 160 acres if you settle it for 5 years. In 1809, it was 320 acres because they realized that people weren't going into these arid western states because 160 acres was really nothing in these states. These people were coming from the eastern states that had quite a bit higher precipitation, and they came into states like Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and thought, oi, 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 we can't make a living off of 160 acres here. So they upped it to 320 acres. Then they reduced the time in 1912 to 3 years instead of 5 years for settling it to get the title to their property. And then in 1916, they upped it actually up to 640 acres of settlement. Additionally, military in lieu of pay would give land bounties from the Revolutionary War. They were given usually soldiers were given 160 acres in lieu of pay to encourage them to settle and to try and not stick the government with a huge salary bill for soldiers in the Revolutionary War. So folks from these eastern states came west. They came west on wagon trains. They came west on horseback. Many were very ill prepared for these journeys. And I'm sure there was a lot of culture shock when folks came from these eastern deciduous forests where lands were green up until wintertime. And they came out across this great basin landscape and thought, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? There's dust, I can see forever. There's no timber around here. There's no water around here. What does somebody do with a landscape like this? But most of them were out to find a better economic condition or an adventure that they didn't have previously. There was a lot of farming that went on. The Great Plains, as you know, were tilled because they were productive farmland. And this settlement of landscapes and the tilling of the Great Plains obviously ultimately led to the Dust Bowl. But folks didn't really, if you look in the background of this picture on the left, there's not much there that would entice a settler to live there, right? Like it's wide open, there's no farm ground there, and more importantly, there's no water there. And so the settlers came west. They started settling places. And so they settled these valley bottoms that had, better soils. It wasn't as rocky, and notably that they had water. Most grazing on Western rangelands, which are all these open spaces, was technically illegal, but since lands weren't deeded, nobody made any attempt to stop it. So it's just sort of a free-for-all out here. And this, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, really led to some fractions in livestock operators between sheep and cattle and between different cattle operators. And so it was the Wild West for sure. I don't know if any of you have ever, if you remember playing the old version of the game, Oregon Trail, but you would have, you were it was a computer game, and you were trying to make it across the Oregon Trail. And rudimentary as it was, it had some good fundamental concepts behind it. And the dreaded thing that would always happen is that you would die of dysentery. And if you know anything about these landscapes, usually this is a result of fecal contamination in water or contaminated food or water. And unfortunately, it was really common for settlers to perish not only from dysentery, but also from many other diseases and hardships along the way. But as settlers got west, it became very critical for them to know where the next water spot was. We all need water. Water is our common denominator, whether we're livestock, wildlife, humans, insects, we all need it. All animals need it, and plants too, to be honest. Although some plants are quite a bit more hardier than others. But water is this limiting factor, and especially on these arid Western landscapes. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in some of these upcoming webinars, but I just want to plant this for you right now that this water is the limiting factor in Western landscapes. Around the early 1900s, we collectively as Americans started having a paradigm shift. We had, free-for-all grazing, we had free-for-all mining. You can see these mining tailings up in this upper right-hand corner. Just, mining companies would come in, there were no regulations, and they would just leave these toxic tailings everywhere that would pollute both groundwater and surface water. There was very little thought given to safety. It was much more about what can we get out of this landscape. People started realizing that maybe this wasn't all that we needed to be as a country, and started thinking about how can we maybe balance our utilitarianism with a little bit more, concern for the landscapes, concern for the humans that inhabited them. And so it resulted in sort of a collective slowdown. We realized that landscapes and lands in the United States were a finite resource, and it's like having a piece of pie, that we're getting down to these last pieces, that these desirable pieces of land have been settled, but the undesirable pieces, these, rocky, arid landscapes that were non-arable, were not settled. So as part of a result of this, the federal government created these federal land management agencies. And so the birth of these agencies, and I'm going to talk primarily about the United States Department of Agriculture's Forest Service and the United States Department of the Interior's Bureau of Land Management, because they are the primary federal land management agencies in the U.S. There are others, as I will acknowledge, but these two are the ones that generally that I'm talking about when I talk about federal land management agencies. The Federal Forest Service dates back to the late 1800s, when Congress created an Office of Special Agent in the Department of Agriculture to assess what the United States had for resources, what they had for timber resources. Forest Service was created to get timber, really, because it's a commodity, right? And so they were responsible for all these timbered landscapes, but that sure left an awful lot of the West that didn't have timber open still. But we weren't there as a country yet. Stockmen also realized that forests were, that they have, especially these open forests, were good grazing material, and so they had been grazing stock there. The Forest Service began charging grazing fees in 1916, and of course, there were lots of conflicts about them that dominated those sort of early days, and probably continue to dominate discussions. The field of range management is actually a relatively new field compared to something like forestry. Forestry has been practiced for many centuries because timber is a commodity product. Rangelands, it's less tangible what the commodity is in rangelands. And the BLM was technically born out of the General Land Office. You can see that photo on the right. Those are surveyors from the General Land Office surveying these Western landscapes. There is some interesting history. Harold Ike was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, and he had a long history of controversy with the Department of Agriculture, specifically about the Forest Service and the grazing. Even though Harold Ikes was primarily responsible for the Taylor Grazing Act, that was passed in 1934, he made some pretty unwise commitments to stockmen to win their support. He promised that there would be no extensive bureaucracy like he felt like he saw in the Forest Service. He felt that grazing fees should be tied to administration, not forage values. And he grossly misrepresented the administration costs. The U.S. Forest Service at that time estimated that it cost 1.5 to 2 million to administer costs of 80 to 160 million acres. And Ikes alleged that the Department of Interior's department could do it for $150,000 a year, which seems absurd. The Tiller Grazing Act was passed in 1934. It established grazing districts on 80 million acres, which later became 142 million acres, and it established what was called the grazing service for this administration. They had 10-year grazing leases, but they required that preference be given to historic range users. The 1939 amendment to this act added advisory boards of 5 to 12 people for these grazing districts. A little bit of a side note, the Soil and Conservation Domestic Allotment Act of 1936 was passed in 1936, recognized that we had some deleterious effects on these landscapes due to the Homesteading Act because homesteaders plowed up, native landscapes and developed native water. And so this act was passed to counter this sort of devastating ecological conservation. It established the Soil Conservation Service, which became the Natural Resources Conservation Service in 1994. BLM was merged with the GLO. Well, the Grazing Service was merged with the GLO in 1946 and created the Bureau of Land Management. In 1944, BLM operators were charged 5 cents per AUM, but in contrast, U.S. Forest Service operators were charged 31 cents per AUM, which created, as you can imagine, some conflicts. Utilitarian views had generally prevailed, but now there was this conservation reservation that was gaining traction. Oftentimes, there was some sparring in Congress. The increases were proposed, and Senator McCarran, who happened to be from Nevada, attacked the grazing service. He suggested that the remaining lands should be disposed to the states or to private entities. Due to these conflicts, the grazing service budget was cut 85% of their $150,000, and it doesn't take a math wizard to figure out that it isn't very much. There was not much left after that. As I said, it was joined with the General Land Office in 1946. And after that, after this turbulence of this great land grab, as it has been called, the management of these two agencies sort of went into this stagnant holding pattern. U.S. Forest Service was being investigated in a series of congressional hearings on their management practices, while the BLM was hamstrung by this reorganization within, as Grazing Service and GLO were merged together, and a continued lack of funding and authority on their landscapes. Meanwhile, we have yet another paradigm shift between, the dust storms in the plains, and then forest fires like the Great Burn in 1910. People were becoming aware that we as humans had consequences on these landscapes, and they were huge. That we had these huge fires, we had huge dust bowls, people were dying because of these things. And so we started to shift as a country collectively from this utilization to preservation and conservation. Started with timber practices in the late 1800s, made that shift into the rangeland world in about the 1930s. But really what rocketed this movement off was not necessarily one particular thing, but maybe a combination of things. Rachel Carson wrote a book in 1962 called Silent Spring, and was, describing the deleterious effects of the use of pesticides. President Nixon signed into act the first Earth Day. People were becoming a lot more aware of the consequences of what we were doing in our environment. Post-World War II, Americans saw quite a bit of prosperity, more prosperity than they had seen possibly ever. by the 1960s and 70s, public interest in how government was making decisions, how those decisions were affecting the communities and the people in those environments, um, were being the interest was growing. In the 1960s and 70s, there were a whole slew of legislation passed, and I'm going to show you this in the next slide. Probably the most important one to note, though, is that in 1969, Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act. It was relatively uncontroversial in its time. It basically just said the federal government has to provide information about like what they plan to do, any activities that are going to happen on public lands, and the public has to be given an opportunity to know about those things. So socially, as a country in the 1960s and 70s, we were concerned about, we were becoming collectively aware of our social responsibilities to people. In these acts that were passed in there, we gave civil rights, voting, fair housing, equal employment, Title IX in education, preventing discrimination against classes of people. Culturally, we understood that we had a history here. Even though we haven't been here for very long collectively, we have a history here. Until we passed the National Historic Preservation Act, we passed the Archaeological Historic Preservation Act, and the Archaeological Resources Act. Environmentally, this is just a few of the ones that were passed. There were many of these that were passed. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, the list goes on. And in the middle of all of these, and it wasn't just Forest Service and BLM, but it was all federal agencies had to comply with all of these acts that were passed. But as land management agencies, those two agencies were really at the epicenter of this collective movement of social involvement and public awareness of what was going on in their landscapes. As federal land management agencies evolved, the first was the passage of the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act in 1960. It is considered the Organic Act for the U.S. Forest Service. In the 1960s, the Forest Service was being pulled in many different directions by special interest groups. And so they wanted to have sort of a mission statement that Congress had written for them that said, this is what we want Forest Service to do. And Congress, having those same special interests in their ears as well, wrote the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960, wrote and passed. And the purpose of that act was to develop, administer the renewable resources of national forests for multiple use and sustained yield of several products and services obtained therefrom. Vague enough to appease everyone and specific enough that everybody thinks it applies to everything. Several years later, a similar act called the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA, was passed in 1976, and it is considered the Organic Act of BLM. FLPMA directed the BLM to manage for multiple uses, to use science to make decisions, to consider past and present uses, to retain federal ownership of lands, and to involve the public for decision making. Meanwhile, special interests continued to have influence on federal land management. This resulted in management unit area planning documents, whether they were forest plans or agency plans. There were lots of plans that came out in the 1960s, 70s, and into the 80s. And so these were plans that each unit, whatever this unit was going to accomplish over 10, 20, 30 years. In BLM and Forest Service engaged in these fairly equally. There were designations that were given. One of the examples is the wilderness designations. Wilderness is defined as one of those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, and then the wilderness area is recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor and does not remain. And so none of these wilderness areas could be developed. With this, it also provided protection for endangered species. We realized that our actions were having effects on particular species and provided protection for those species. There were also special recreation designations. Post-World War II, the public started to be out in our landscapes more. There were both motorized and non-motorized, which led to the designation of roadless areas, wild and scenic rivers, and much later, these off-highway vehicle recreation areas. Um, some of these some of these designations became overlapping, and I'll show you this a little bit later on, in fact, in just a few slides. Um, and and some of them made it really challenging for these federal land management agencies to manage these multiple things together. Wild horses and burros also came out in this, the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act was also passed in the same area or the same era. And also came with its own special set of designations that you all know as herd management areas or wild horse territories. Uh, at the same time, there was to engage the public, there were a number of publicity campaigns. If you guys have never seen some of these early ones, I highly encourage you to look them up. There's the Youth Conservation Corps that did these, amazing conservation projects on public lands. Woods Yowl, if you guys remember that one, the Give a Hoot, Don't Pollute. Smokey Bear, obviously one of the most successful publicity campaigns in history. Only you can prevent forest fires. And if you've never heard of Johnny Horizon, this is the BLM one from the 1970s. It was an anti-litter campaign from the BLM, slogan being, "This is your land, keep it clean." I will put a plug in there if you guys have never seen the BLM rap video from the 1990s. I highly recommend it. Go Google it. All right. One more act, the Equal Access to Justice Act. The Equal Access to Justice Act, the purpose of it was to ensure that the high legal costs of going to court didn't deter entities or individuals from seeking justice against wrongs committed by the federal government, so that they would be able to get justice. It authorized the award of attorney's fees and all the other expenses that come with these litigations to entities that prevail against the federal government in judicial proceedings. Just as a little snapshot of this, these are the amounts per year that have been awarded to individuals and entities because they have prevailed against the federal government. I will tell you that the bulk of these come from Veterans Affairs and Social Security Administration, but there's no small chunk that comes from both Department of Agriculture and Department of Interior as well. So there's much more information about this online, but the bottom line of this is that we collectively as taxpayers have paid out just shy of $700 billion. $700 million over the last 5 years. That's just the last 5 years. That's a pretty extensive chunk of change. Okay. All right. Well, this is it. I'm not going to keep you too much longer. Public land management today is a sticky wicket, right? Because we have all these legal mandates, all those acts that were passed in the 1960s and 70s, they're all still in effect today. And they challenge both the Forest Service and the BLM because they have to manage for all of these multiple uses. And oftentimes those land uses are kind of considered competing. So in this graphic on the left, this is a herd management area in the northern part of California. It is roughly just shy of 800,000 acres. It honestly, the map is what we in GIS tell people to never make because it's so busy and so obnoxious. But the point of this map is that not that it looks like a unicorn that puked all over the page, but really to show you that there's so many land uses out there. For example, the red, yellow, and green big polygons there are sage grouse habitat. You can see a red outline within the blue outline. The blue outline is the herd management area boundary. The red outline in the center of that is a 315,000 acre fire that burned in 2012. There are water sources out there. There are weeds out there. There's cultural resource managements out there. There's areas of critical environmental concern. There's cultural resource management areas. There's wilderness study areas. This place has a lot going on. You look over the landscape and you think, man, how could there be that much out there? But there is, and this is also a wild horse and burro principally designated area. So what's the bottom line to all this? The bottom line is that federal land management is, no matter what way you cut it, it's complicated business. And I think that it's a tribute to those who work in federal land management that they are doing the best that they can with all these competing resources and the science that they have to be able to answer the questions for all these. Okay. All right. Up next, I'm hoping that this webinar has been a good lead in into now where Stephanie is going to take this next month with from the Horse and Burro Act. Now, where have we gone from here? And I will take any questions that you may have. And I just want to give a plug for this is actually taken in the Twin Peaks herd management area. And if you thought that was the horse I was on, it's actually a rock. But it's that's what I got for you guys.